Then Almitra spoke, saying, "We would ask now of death." And he said, "You would know the secret of death, but how shall you find it unless you seek it in the heart of life? The owl whose night-bound eyes are blind unto the day cannot unveil the mystery of light. If you would indeed behold the spirit of death, open your heart wide unto the body of life, for life and death are one, even as the river and the sea are one." The Prophet Khalil Gibran. Death is not a comfortable topic for us. It's something that is the ultimate unknown. And it's something that human beings have tried to control, tried to navigate, tried to understand, tried to rationalize since really the dawn of our species. Thousands of years ago, the Egyptians and many other civilizations built massive tombs for themselves. And in today's world, we still have many discussions around the nature of death and the nature and what we're allowed to do when it comes to remains and our bodies and the memories of our people who have passed. Even the way we talk about the dead is in the past tense. There are so many things that have been built up around this aspect of life, this ending of life, this transition of life, that really, I would say, the bulk of religion is geared towards understanding and preparing us for that. Throughout today, we've heard many excellent speakers talk about how death comes into their practices, and I think it's fitting that we end off today on the idea of ancestor veneration. So over the next 45 minutes, we will be discussing ancestor veneration. We'll be discussing a little bit about what it is, but also going a little bit deeper into my personal practice. My name is Benjamin Stimson. I am very pleased to be coming to you from Ontario, Canada, but I am originally from North Wales, a little place called Cerwis, and I am so pleased to be able to deliver this to the South Wales Occult Conference. So who am I? I'm an author, I'm a folklorist, I'm a podcaster, and a therapist in my regular life. I'm also a spiritual practitioner. I've had the luck to be involved with various traditions around the world over my lifetime, and particularly these 5 which have really informed my ancestral work. I am a devotee to my ancestors, just as I am a devotee to the generations to come. Some of the traditions I've been involved with and which we will discuss today has been neo-paganism, espiritismo, a Caribbean-based form of spiritism, Lukumi, Santeria or Regla de Ocha, a West African, Cuban tradition worshipping spirits known as the Orishas, and which ancestor veneration is a big component. I've also had the wonderful chance to be involved with Hinduism and British folk tradition. I'm also the author of Ancestral Whispers, a guide to developing ancestral veneration practices, which came out through Llewellyn in 2023. So with that, what are we talking about today? Our discussion today will be in 3 parts. We're going to talk a little bit about the basics, really to describe what ancestor veneration actually is. What is the worldview, what are some of the practices, and what are some of the rituals connected to it. We'll then be going through 2, I would say, major pieces to ancestor work, which is the ritual of the shared space. I'll be taking you through 2 shrine setups that I've worked with in my various practices, and really going through the elements of these shrines. What are they composed of? Why are they composed of those things? What is the worldview that is showing up in this? And ultimately, how are these shrines used? We'll also be talking about the ancestors themselves, and I'll be taking you through a grouping of my own ancestors. we often think of ancestors only in blood relationships, but I think that we need to really see that as a very small, very Western point of view. Ancestors are so much more than that. There are so many other forms of ancestor that we can work with and talk to and interact with and whatnot. So we'll be talking about the different types of ancestors. I'll be talking about specifically the concept of a spirit court, which you see in various traditions, mostly in the Caribbean and South America, and in spiritism-based traditions. And then we will come to the end. We'll discuss how ancestor could be the land itself, all of the other beings that are within a landscape or who have walked on that landscape. And that should bring us to the end of the day and the end of the conference. So much of the conversation of death is on grief and mourning and what you do here in the living space, right? What we do with the body, what we do with the rituals about pushing the person or helping that person transition to the next side, right? Ancestor work, on the other hand, is different. It is about life. It is about the continuation of life, and it is about the continuation of relationship while we are still living and while they are dead. So there's a couple of huge big things that we need to go through in order for nothing to be left unsaid. The big one is that there is a definitive worldview, and from my research and from my work, this worldview is pretty universal. When it comes to ancestor work, the majority of the other non-Western cultures that have ancestor veneration as a core component of their culture all share these following ideas, and this is a general worldview. It's the idea that death is not an end. There is this idea that the dead still have an impact on the world of the living. They are still capable in their afterlife state to impact the world. This is very different from the Western point of view, where we relegate the dead to just over the hill, to some faraway, non-connected place, or to oblivion. This is, I think, where the issue of talking about the dead in the past tense comes in, because we don't see them as being real anymore. There is a certain atheism to that. Even within Christianity, there is a certain atheism to this idea that the dead are no longer existing, no longer living, no longer capable of being here, no longer capable of connecting with us, that they are completely removed. And this is not true for the vast majority of spiritual traditions around the world. The third piece here is that living humans can communicate directly with the dead through ritual practices. If we accept that the dead that death is not an end, that the dead still have an impact in the world, that they still have some connection here, then it stands to reason that we can communicate with them then. Taking that one step further, another belief here is that the dead have needs in that death state, in that afterlife, and that we as the living can cater to those needs. This is where the idea of offerings comes in, where the idea of celebrations which give to the dead or honor the dead in some way, or give them something that they can use in that afterlife state, right? We then go into this space of, okay, if we're able to communicate with them and they're able to communicate with us, if they are able to impact our world, then that stands to reason that ancestor veneration, the practice of ancestor veneration, becomes a shared space of contact between the living and the dead. These are the practices, the rituals, and the worldview of encounter between the dead and the living. And so with that, then, we begin to separate ancestor work from mourning and grief practices, which are both very important still. but they have a certain time limit. They have a certain zone that they exist within, as opposed to ancestor work. Ancestor work comes after the process of mourning and after the grief process has run its course. And of course, mourning is always going to be happening. There is no end to mourning. But where ancestor work comes in is it shifts the narrative away from death being the end, that the dead still have no impact, that there is no ability to have relationship with the dead. And therefore, the idea that we are losing something, as opposed to witnessing a transformation that we also will go through one day, is a big thing. And many people who I have looked into and documentaries and interviews from people who have connected with their dead through ancestor work have all spoken about how the practices have actually alleviated that mourning because they have faith that there is something more than this. They have connection, they have a continuing relationship. Another big piece here then is, if we take that worldview, we see then this show up in practices, which is things like maintaining a shrine, offering offerings, offering prayers, divination with the dead, and then communal and individual experiences connected to all of those other practices. Just like other forms of spirituality and religion, you have group identity connected to these traditions, and you also have individual experiences that feed into that individual identity piece. This then feeds into the different types of relationships that ancestor work can impact. Obviously, we have different types of ancestors, and I'll talk about those later on. And each of those different types of ancestors, there is a different relationship that comes with them. There is also the idea of having different relationships, just as in life. We have different relationships with different members of the dead. And so our relationship to our deceased grandmother or great-grandmother is going to be very different from our relationship to a great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather who we never knew in life, but who is coming through, perhaps through other forms of communication or through other ritual practices. We have different relationships with each other because of these practices. In a communal setting, if we're practicing traditions that are also shared by members of our ethnic minority, our language minority, our community, our culture, then we are able to connect and relate in a different way than if we didn't have these practices, right? And I think this is particularly important for members of the neo-pagan or for the occult community, because our communities are just starting to re-emerge. Many of them have only been around 50, 60, 70 years. Many are much older than that and have been around for a while. So how do we then bring in ancestral work into these traditions, many of which are new to us? Many of us have converted to these traditions, right? We begin to relate differently. And then how do we relate with ancestors who are coming from a different faith from us, but are ancestral to us, right? This then gets into questions about responsibilities, obligations, and duties. We often, I think, one of the issues with Western spirituality is that there can be an almost Protestant centering of self, individualism within spirituality. It's our spiritual journey, and that's all that matters. What we want to do, what we do, our practices, our tradition, our spirituality. When we step into ancestral work, though, we're suddenly working with individuals and groups going back for infinite number of years. We're no longer individual in that. We are a link in a chain going back into the infinite past, right? It isn't just about us. When we do these practices, we are essentially communicating and relating to others. And so in that way, we need to decenter ourselves from this practice and center the community of ancestors, whoever those communities happen to be, whether they be blood, whether they be lineage, whether they be other forms of ancestor. And that can be very humbling. But I think that this is a worldview you often see surviving ancestral veneration practices in communal collectivist cultures as opposed to individualistic cultures. However, I think this is why people are really wanting to connect with and develop ancestral work in the West, because our culture has become so individualistic. And because it's so individualistic, we have lost many of the things that bound us together: shared experiences, a shared sense of identity within group. And I think that this is, at least from my own research, this is something that we are looking for. So why is worldview important? I believe strongly that any practice must be in congruence with worldview. And when working with ancestors, there must be a shared worldview. We can come into practicing ancestor work from our own point of view, but we're working with ancestors who, when they were alive, held certain worldview. And so we have to be sensitive to that. We also have to work within a certain cultural worldview if we're working with ancestors from those cultures, right? We have to, when I say we have to, I think we need to be sensitive to how our own biases, our own worldview can create opportunities for misunderstanding or opportunities for connection. And I think that that's a really important piece. When we look at ancestor work around the world, oftentimes they are community-based, and that they incorporate that culture and that community. Many of us now have mixed heritage. I myself come from multiple lands of the UK. My family come from Ireland, from Scotland, from England, from Wales, from Cornwall, and that's only within the past 5 generations. Many people in North America have even more mixed heritage. And so they are working with ancestors who came from very different cultural understandings. And it creates questions of how do you incorporate this practice, how do you bring this into, how do you honor these ancestors in a certain way that is going to be culturally sensitive, and then also what worldview generally are you working from, And I think that this is a really important point to consider before starting to explore spirit work in general, ancestor work in general, because it's not just about you, as I said in the previous slide. I think this is also a really important piece, and a worldview piece here is, why is veneration about life and not death? I've said that multiple times now. And I think that, again, this is a worldview piece. We're so centered on mourning in the West because of the past 100 years of the funeral industry and that Protestant individualism. It's created a divorce from death. This is why death is so scary to us all. But I think that if we shift our focus away from grief and mourning taking up the entire conversation, we start to then see that no, veneration is about life, because it's about relating to ancestors who can assist us in life. In the same way that as we transition into becoming ancestors ourselves, we will then take on that responsibility to the living, to impact the world as we hopefully would see fit, in a way that's going to be bountiful and stable and supportive of those future generations coming in. So, I would say that the majority of ancestor veneration is really focused on the continuation of life. That's really the agenda of the ancestors, is to continue life and to create more ancestors, right? But also to create that mantle and perpetuate that cycle over and over again. It's very different from deities. It's very different from other spirits, like spirit guides or spirits in the landscape. They have very different agendas. But our ancestral agenda is to continue life and to perpetuate. And this is why worldview is so important, because it's the underscore of the relationship that will allow us to then thrive, and through our thriving, we will be able to be in the best position to support the future generations coming in. So before we look at some of the shrines that I have constructed for us to go through, let's talk a little bit about the purpose of shrines in ancestor work. And I would say this really applies to shrines of all sorts of different spirits, but in particular in the ancestor work, really they are specific places of ancestral work. Right? The graveyard is often a place that we associate with the dead and working with the dead. But throughout the world, many traditions have separate shrines that are set apart to particularly worship or to venerate the ancestors. It is usually, almost always, a demarcated space, just in the same way that we in the West look at the cemetery as being a separate place, a place that is demarcated for the dead. Shrines, particularly those existing in the home, are demarcated spaces. They are not the same as a graveyard or burial place, because oftentimes the dead are not contained within them. That being said, there are some traditions where the shrine is where the dead and the remains of the dead are kept. They are often tended to daily, so the Western, particularly neo-pagan approach to only working with the dead during Halloween or Samhain is not something that is often found throughout the world. Particularly in Africa, Asia, and in South America and the Caribbean, the dead are worked with every day. They are an integrated part of the everyday life. They are not only coming once a year. Now, that being said, there are certainly traditions, particularly traditions that are heavily Catholic, where the dead only come once a year. I'm thinking particularly of the Mexican Day of the Dead, or the Day of the Dead, All Hallows, Feast of All Saints and whatnot, during the Halloween season. Now, that being said, for those traditions that have shrines, they are either, unsurprisingly, erected all year round, or in the case of, say, Mexican Day of the Dead or All Hallows in the Catholic sense, they are erected only in specific times around that time period. Other traditions like Hinduism only worship the dead, or work with the dead, or placate the dead during Pitru Paksha, which is around the same time as Navratri, at the end of October and beginning of November, after the harvest, and that is a period of a month where they believe that the dead come back to the ancestral home to hang out until they can go back to where they belong. Oftentimes, shrines on a physical basis will reflect the worldview and the cosmology of that worldview, and that's something that you'll see in the examples that I have. And after I've pointed this out to you, I think you'll be able to read shrines anywhere in a way that will give you some insight. You might not necessarily know the data, but you can read, usually in altar or a shrine, around kind of what, or ask good questions around, what is the purpose of the shrine, why are certain objects placed in certain places, why is the shrine located in a certain geographic location, such as the south end, the north end, the west end, or the east end of the house. Why is a shrine in a particular space within the house? For example, is it close to the back door? Is it close to the kitchen? Is it close to the front door? And so on and so on. There are all sorts of reasons why. For ancestral work particularly, a little different for theistic work or working with other forms of spirits, particularly for ancestors, the majority of these shrines tend to be in domestic dwellings. There are, of course, cultures where it is inappropriate to have the dead inside the home, and so they are relegated to some outside external space, or they may even be in a necropolis, like a cemetery or like a like a mortuary temple. The whole point of the shrine when it's in the home, or even shrines in general, are that it affirms the boundaries between life and death. That it is a separate space. It is not integrated. It is not so integrated into the home or into the community that people are. The distinction between life and death is corrupted or is confusing. It means then that the very shrine itself sets up this is the land of the living, this is the space of the dead, and the two exist in those places. The shrine becomes the meeting point. The shrine becomes that communal place, and it's a safe place to do so. And ultimately, it is utilitarian in nature. Decoration only serves a purpose, right? You don't tend to find objects and things within a shrine that doesn't have a purpose. Oftentimes, when you look and you do research into multiple traditions, you will see that everything inside a shrine, an altar, has a purpose, and they're not just uselessly decorating. Even decoration serves a purpose. For example, in Chinese cosmology, the reason that ancestor shrines tend to be red is because red is a symbol of prosperity, and you want your dead to be prosperous in the afterlife because they will then bring that prosperity into your life, right? So even something simple as color, although color is never simple. So without further ado, let's go into exploring two types of shrines that I have had personal relationship with in Lukumi and espiritismo, and we'll then talk a little bit about what we saw in these shrines. So this is a very traditional Lukumi shrine. It is very African-based. There is an alternative form that we'll talk about with the espiritismo tradition that is also practiced in the Lukumi tradition, but this is a very Afrocentric version. It's called an Egun shrine. Egun is the Yoruba word for ancestor, for the dead. So what we have here basically is a very basic chalk, usually cascarilla or efun, which is white clay coming from a river, a semicircle placed onto the ground. Usually this is close to the back door or even sometimes outside. And inside the semicircle is the place for offerings for the dead. Outside is, of course, for the place for the living and life. You have 9 little streaks that intersect the efun line, and that 9 is a very important number. 9 is an important number for death anyways, cross-culturally, but in the Lukumi tradition particularly, there are ideas that it is connected to Oya, the Orisha, who is connected to death. She is not deaf, she is connected to death. There's a big difference there. But there is this idea that 9 is the number of Oya. What we have here are various elements that are very culturally specific, and they have specific reasons for why they're here. If you go to West Africa, it will be a little different. If you go to Brazil, it'll be a little different. This form started to come out into Lukumi because the original ancestral practices were lost in Cuba, and so they went. Many of the priests in the 1930s, I believe, or even in 1950s, greater connections between Brazil, which also had a West African religion that was based on the same practices as Lukumi was, same spirits, same traditions, same gods. They managed to incorporate or reincorporate this back into the tradition. You have here white flowers, white being a form of purity, white being the color of death, basically. You have here various food offerings. The importance here of working with the ancestors in the Lukumi tradition is that you are working with them as foundational to who you are. So they are literally the foundations that the rest of society and the rest of the world are built off of. And so you often will give them a spoonful or give them a meal when you are eating, particularly if you cook your own, on a regular basis in order to literally feed the dead. This is not just offering for symbolic purpose, this is literally feeding the dead. And the idea is that the dead are inside the earth. They are not in the sky. And so you place the offerings down onto the ground and where they're accessible. You also have here, if you look on the right side, you have a stick that is standing inside the shrine. This is called an egun stick. And basically that is a parastel. It is an axis mundi. It connects the world of the dead with the world of the living. And this is a ritual object that when you become initiated into these traditions, your godfather or godmother will take you out and find the right stick, and you will then prepare it and oftentimes bead it so that it is part of your ancestral shrine there. I don't have one because I did not go that far into these traditions, and so my shrine doesn't lacks one of these egun sticks. You see down below three cups and glasses of liquid, and these are very specific. You have a white, some sort of a white alcohol, so wine or tequila or white vodka, whatever it is, white rum. And it's particularly white in order to cool. White is a cooling color in these traditions, as well as a color of death. You also have a glass of water. This usually has sugar or molasses mixed into it, and that's representative of the ancestors who were killed in the Middle Passage in the slave trade as they were being brought over to the plantations. This is a very specific offering in this tradition to those specific ancestors. You also have coffee. Coffee is a stimulant. You often find that coffee is given cross-culturally, particularly in South America and in Africa. And so coffee it's a substance that is rich, it's prosperity, it's also a stimulant. And so you will often have coffee in this. You will also have at least one lit candle. Candle is a symbol of light, God's light. This tradition is a monotheistic tradition. There is one God with many spirits underneath him or underneath them, and so that represents an aspect of God, but also is a form of life as well. And so you're placing a little bit of life into this space for the dead. So now, because of the migration of the religion outside of Cuba, it's now migrated to North America, it's now migrated to South America. It's all over the world, really. There's traditions all over the world connected to it. There are some adaptations that have occurred, and this is one of these adaptations. So in the previous shrine, you saw that there were no images displayed, and that was mainly because of how the tradition was taken or received from Brazilians, where photography was just too expensive. Most people couldn't afford to have photographs, and so they just didn't have them. In West Africa, in some traditions, you will find small little figurines that represent the ancestors. That's a very widespread African thing. But in this particular tradition, that was not an innovation that was carried on. When in North America now, it is becoming a lot more popular to include images of your ancestors, and a lot more people have those images, so they're placing them in, and so you will often find them similar setup to the previous one, but with the inclusion of images. Now, this brings us to an espiritismo boveda. So espiritismo is a form of spiritism. When Allan Kardec revealed his tradition of spiritism to the world, it's related to spiritualism. The two kind of evolved around the same time, and they connected with each other, and they were sometimes in competition with each other. Espiritismo developed in Brazil and the Caribbean, and it was often called white people's magic. It was incorporated into some of these traditions, particularly in actually most Caribbean islands that are of a Catholic Spanish background, incorporated some form of espiritismo. What you basically have here is a syncretic practice. This was, and for many people still is, the primary form of working with spirits that are not orishas or spirits that are not divine in some way. This is the primary form of working with spirit guides, and also the primary form of working with ancestors for those spiritual houses in Lukumi that don't practice the Egun shrine version that we saw just previously. And again, what we have here is very similar in many ways, just different elements. So we have here, first thing you'll see is the white cloth underneath. That white cloth is foundational. If you think of it like the semicircle that is drawn on the ground, it sets out a demarcated space. The white cloth is the demarcated space that everything else is built on top of. You have here the candles, and in this tradition, they are symbols of light. They are symbols of divine light and divine guidance, and life being placed into this place, into this space. You see here many other elements of white, and white in this sense is purity, not so much death. So in Lukumi, I misspoke before. Black tends to be the color of death because it is the color of night, because it's the color of the ground, the deep ground, right? So whereas white is that color of the divine, of light, of life, and of purity. And so you see then many elements on this table are white. You have white flowers, you have white candles, and you have white, if you look just on the right-hand side there, you will see cascaria, which is a chalk that is made out of crushed shells. And that's used to mark, that's used as a form of a product in order to cleanse yourself with, and really a product that you mark your body with, particularly if you are going into initiation or if you're having a rogation, for example. The biggest component on this table here is the large fishbowl in the center. Oftentimes, some kind of a vessel will be filled with water. Water is a substance of purity and a substance of life, because water flows. And so you'll find that on Bóvedas, this is called a fuente, a fountain. And that water will be changed routinely to keep it pure, to keep it fresh, and that is what oftentimes people will cleanse themselves with. It is also a form of technology because water is seen as conducive for spirits, and so oftentimes spirits will appear in the water. And you can see in this example we have many bubbles within the water on the outside, or in the inside I should say, and that is often taken as a sign of something spiritual is happening. Around the table you see many different elements here. Now this is a shrine particularly geared towards ancestors. So we have on the wall behind images of the ancestors. We also have images of the saints. This is coming from mainly Catholic countries. You have images of saints, and those saints are usually connected to ancestors. Oftentimes people are named after saints, they have patron saints, and so if you don't have an image for a particular ancestor, for example, but want to represent them, you may represent them instead with an image of a saint. Oftentimes also saints have an ancestral connection to the family. You have here sometimes things like the Holy Bible will be there, or other forms of books. In Misa Blanca, for example, which is Puerto Rican espiritismo, you'll often find the books of Allar Kardec on the table as well. You have rosaries. Oftentimes these rosaries or these spiritual tools will be connected to the ancestors, or they'll be used by espiritistas to use with their workings. You see here the 5 or the 7 smaller glasses that are arranged in a V shape. Oftentimes, some people will have multiple glasses surrounding their main fuente, and each one of those represents a virtue. They can be arranged to represent God. They can be arranged to represent different types of ancestors too. We have this idea of spirit corps coming up. So what we have here is essentially a syncretic practice, an eclectic practice in some ways, but it is all grounded in specific worldviews, and these worldviews are shared with those ancestors. So we have a community being shown in this space. So we have here several takeaways, and I'm more than prepared to say that these are general takeaways. This idea of shrines and sacred spaces are utilitarian. Tools and things that are displayed on these spaces have meaning, but they also have function too. They are spaces of encounter, as we said before. They are primarily used for communication purposes. You're communicating with the dead or the ancestors in these spaces. They are understandable to all the spirits and living involved. In the previous two examples, we saw that there were elements within there that were specific nods to the experiences of those ancestors. They were understandable to the practitioners, to the living, and also understandable to the dead. Again, shrines are informed by and affirm worldview, and in many traditions they tend to be very syncretic. You see incorporation of the state religion or the overarching cultural paradigm, but you also tend to find then the minority traditions, the other traditions, the parallel traditions of those cultures that are flowing next to. We have then displayed religious beliefs held by the ancestors themselves, religious beliefs of the venerators, and culturally relevant and shared traditions. And more often than not, you find these spaces inside domestic dwellings or inside domestic spaces. They are not necessarily out in the public where anybody can have access to them. They're very intimate. They tend to be only used by the family or by the group, because those ancestors are only connected to those individuals. This is the other thing too about ancestor work. It can be supremely group-oriented, while also every single individual within that group having their own individual ancestors within that. So this then brings us to this idea of who the actual ancestors are. And I think this is, again, an issue with how the Western world views the dead. We tend to really only really look at our biological ancestors and those biological ancestors that are directly related to us. We don't tend to often automatically assume that adopted ancestors are real, right? That is our cultural upbringing coming from. So I think this is a good way of looking at it. We have multiple different types of ancestors. We have those who came before, those who contributed to the development of individuals and the community. They don't have to be biological. Those who created the context of the present. And this leads into this idea that not all the ancestors are dead, and not all dead are ancestors. You can have the dead who are not ancestral to us, but you can also have ancestors who are not dead also. And so we have these various different ideas here. We have lineage, which is those who have contributed to who we are, and we are the next stage in their links of chain. We have biology, obviously one we often think about. We have conceptual ancestors. These are individuals who we may not necessarily think of them as real, but they have an impact in our society. They have an impact on us, and so they are, as a concept, ancestral to us. We also have ancestors of place, those people who lived and dwelled in the same places that we live and dwell, just separated by time. They contributed to our experience now, and so they are ancestral to place. These are people who lived in your house before you lived there, right? You may come across things that they left or that they did that you're experiencing. They are then ancestral to you. And then this last one here, fictional ancestors, something that I'm particularly interested in. These are more like conceptual ancestors. These are the characters that we encounter in fiction that contribute to who we are, impact who we are, and who we look up to. And this really ties into then what we'll be discussing with Spirit Corps. So who are my ancestors? All of these are my ancestors. These are my biological ancestors. These are the people who contributed to who I am now. They literally created me. There are aunts and uncles in here. There are great-grandparents and great-great-great-grandparents going back all the way. And this is the collection of images that I am very lucky to have. These are the images that I have on my ancestor shrine. But these are not the only ancestors that I have, because I also have many, many ancestors connected to parts of my life. In quite a few spiritual traditions around the world, groups of spirits are connected by what we would call a spirit court. We particularly see this language in South American and Caribbean traditions. And these spirit courts are collections of spirits that are connected to particular attributes or things in the world. A very good example of this is in Espiritismo Cruzado, the Espiritismo that exists in Cuba. There are 7 broad groupings of spirits that have particular identities. They have group identities. You have gitanas, you have madamas, you have, it's not a term I would generally use, but you have gypsies, and in that tradition they tend to be individuals who are of a Roma background. You also tend to have things like in Venezuela, you have the Viking court, or the physician's court, or the spirit court of the holy thugs, right? Individuals, criminals who, in death, saw the wayward ways as being bad, and so they are now interceding, almost like folk saints in many ways. They act as in similar way as saints. They intercede on behalf of the living in order to hopefully push them into healthy lifestyles, right? So, taking this idea of spirit courts, I'm looking at my own life, and these are the ancestors, these are the courts that I regularly interact with. These are all aspects of my life and many of the people who are connected to them by profession. This is getting into lineage, and this is getting into this idea of being a part of a group identity. So for me, some of the major spirit courts that I work with are writers, therapists, folklorists, other spiritual practitioners, and members of the LGBT community. These are individuals who I can look to for inspiration, that I have relationship with because of shared experience. And this is very different from working with family, right? Working with biological family or with adopted family. I'm related to them by virtue of me being part of the group that they're also a part of, but I'm also connected to all of these individuals. We have people like Carl Jung and Dr. Freud. We have individuals like down here, Matthew Shepard, or Anne Lister of Shibden Hall, the ladies of Llangollen, the lovers who lived in Llangollen for such a long time. You have individuals like Aleister Crowley, Pixie, we have Dr. D, we have Allar Kardec, Bella Fowler of Denby, right? These are some of the important individuals I look up to when I think of my spirituality and my practice. And so as a group, we all exist within a group together. All of those who are sitting in the audience now, you belong to groups in your own life, and those groups have spirits connected to them, professions, social groupings, cultures, and whatnot. And so This has really revolutionized my way of working with spirits and ancestors, because my sense of ancestry has just expanded exponentially, and it fits who I am. This is circling back to individualism here. This is where the individualism aspect of ancestor work comes in, because I can now tailor my ancestral practice to be inclusive of all of the parts of myself now, as opposed to only having to work with family. Because that's one of the big issues with ancestor work for a lot of people, is that they don't want to work with family because they don't have a good relationship with their most recent living family members, right? Now, how does this then expand to include the landscape? Now, this brings us to the end. Why I loved the idea of speaking to the South Wales Occult Conference so much is, being from Wales myself originally, although having spent many, many years in Canada, it felt really like a homecoming for me. I have such a vivid relationship with Britain because I still remember it. I moved over when I had many memories still of that place, and I still have a really strong spiritual connection to that place. It's home. That's why I'm coming home. So for me, when I think of kind of who I am and how I developed and my spirituality, it is connected in with the land. It is connected in with landscape. There is a relationship to that place that I don't have with Canada. And that's been made abundantly clear over my time over here. So when it comes to me thinking about how different ancestors can show up, the land itself is an ancestor for me. The land itself is an ancestor to everybody sitting in this audience right now. You all have relationships with the places that you're in, the places you're from, the places that you are adopted into, the places that you dwell. You have relationship with those places. In the same way that all of the other beings and all of the other people living in that space has a relationship to that space. Now, my ancestors also happen to have a relationship to that place as well, and that impacts my relationship to that place. But everybody has a relationship to wherever they are. And because it predates us, the land itself, the world itself, the universe itself is an ancestor. And this comes to the end of our very brief discussion around ancestor work and some deeper techniques. I would like to thank you all for joining me, and also thank you for coming to this event today. I wish I was there in person with you, but I will be there next year. If you're interested in learning more about ancestor work, I have written a book on this, Ancestral Whispers, A Guide to Building Ancestral Veneration Practices. It's available through Llewellyn and should be available in bookstores all over the UK. And I go deeper into many of the things that I brought up today. If you'd like to learn more about me and my work, you can go to benstimson.com. I have a podcast, I have other work that I've done, I have courses and classes, and so much more. So for those who are sitting in the audience and are heading out soon for your dinner, diolch yn fawr iawn, noswaith da, and I will hopefully be live with you just after this ends to answer any questions. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of the weekend, and I will see you next year. Thank you.